Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshiva Dvar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. We have Berachot first. It's the first Masechet in Zerayim. And the second Masechet in Zerayim is Demai. Demai is an unusual Masechet because it talks about what do you do with Amaratzim? What do you do with them? How do you handle it? They may be well-intentioned, they may even be religious, but they didn't learn any Torah, they don't know how to handle food, they don't know how to observe anything, and it creates a lot of problems if you're trying to do things with Kedusha. The Masechet Peah is an unusual Masechet in every other Masechet in either the Bavli or the Yerushalmi, which is why Rabbi Horowitz and I wanted to work on it, particularly Chapter 1, Halacha 1. Masechet Peah is unusual because it talks about the greatness and the majesty and the importance in deep agadic ways on why it's so important to learn Torah and why Torah learning is so special and why, even if you're not learning Torah now, why you should try to learn Torah at least an hour a day. Because Masechet Peah lays out these deep, beautiful things on what does Torah learning mean, what do the mitzvot mean, and then it gives this unusual halacha and sugya at the end of the Masechet, talking about how to live your life, what to do with your life, and it lays out a roadmap. But it starts with Torah learning, and you don't see that in other Masechtot where it's giving a roadmap on how to live your life and what to do. I think to start Masechet Peah, we have to go back to Berachot, because the first line that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi puts down here in the mishnah, it only is deeper and deeper the more you think about it and learn about it. It's only the first line, but you see how precise it is. So in chapter 8, Halacha 6 of Berachot, there's a discussion between Shammai and Hillel about when do you say the bracha, how should the bracha be composed for Havdalah at the end of Shabbos? Should the creation of fire be mentioned in the past tense or the present tense? And it goes by Hillel. It should be mentioned in the present tense. And it has to do with how things are created, separation between light and dark, and the things of the 6 days. And Masechet Berachot goes to the statement of trying to understand with the word time. And the first line of the Mishnah and Peah puts things in with time. So the Mishnah has this element of time in it. And so when we go to look in Berachot in Halacha 6, chapter 8 in the Yerushalmi, there's a statement, La da'at le'ot et ya'af there. And that's from Job. I'm sorry, from Yeshayahu. And in Yeshayahu, they're talking about to understand how to respond to the moment, to time, and to those who thirst for the word of Hashem. Now, there's an interesting vowelization explanation with the separation of light and dark in Bereshit that's explained in Berachot by Rabbi Yochanan. And it's talking about, do you know the place where the light of the 6 days is hidden in creation? This is from Job. And Rabbi Yochanan explains that in Eretz Yisrael, they used to vowelize that in a way where you can understand it as that that light that difference between light and dark and where this light is hidden. It's hidden for the righteous, and it's hidden for the people who are learning and following mitzvot. And it's hidden away for them. And it's this Eretz Yisrael vowelization from the book of Job that Rabbi Yochanan points out that shows us that there's a special treasure for those who are studying and learning Torah, that you're going to be able to reach this hidden light, this organush. And that's why Peah is so unusual, because it talks about the importance of learning Torah, the majesty, and then it gives you, the rest of the Masechet gives you a roadmap for how to treat the poor, how to treat the people that are less fortunate than you, and then for what you should do in your own life, and how to live your life so that you have this deep and meaningful system where you can reach this hidden light that Rabbi Yochanan talks about. Now, the first mishnah in Halacha chapter 1, Peah, it says, these are the mitzvot that have no measure, no minimum and maximum limit. Now remember, we had this argument between Hillel and Shammai about the context of time and this thing of knowledge and time in Yeshayahu that I just mentioned, and how these mitzvahs here are measured in time. There's other mitzvahs that are not time bound, but these ones are. Peah very much is a time bound thing because the crops are continuously created. They're created every season. Bikkorim, the pomegranate crops are continuously created. So these are the things that have no minimum measure, no maximum measure, no upward limit. And these are Peah, Bikkorim, appearing in the temple on the festivals, performing acts of kindness, and Torah study. Rabbi Horowitz, who's not with us today because he wasn't feeling well, we were looking at this last week, and we're amazed at the precision of this, because these are the only 5 mitzvahs in the Torah that are from the 613 mitzvot that have the following things in common. They have to have these 3 traits: that there's no minimum, there's no maximum, and also these generate fruit in this world and the world to come. And that's amazing when you think about it, because there are other halachot that they might not have a maximum, but they also have to have this other quality of no minimum. So the redactor of the Mishnah picks out these out of the 613, and these are very much rooted in time. Now you say, what does Peah have to do with Torah study? And what we discovered when we were looking at it is each one of these 5 are more similar to the one that's next to it than the furthest one. So Peah and Bikkorim are very similar. They're agricultural crops. They're dealing with things that are grown now. Bikkorim's a little different because it has to do with the fruits of Eretz Yisrael. Peah does not necessarily have to. Appearing in the temple on the festivals, again, that's time. That's time bound. And performing acts of kindness. You see somebody that is needy today, and that you rush to do a mitzvah now. It's in the moment. It's now. And then, of course, Torah study. What are you going to do with your time? How are you going to elevate yourself so that you can start to know what to do, and what to do with your time, and what to do when you're actually in the world, having to interact with the world and with people? Are you going to be doing things so that you think that it's good for you, but in fact you're stealing? In chapter 5, in Halacha 3, chapter 5 in Peah, there's a great story about you hire your poor son, to work behind you to pick up the grain. As you cut the grain, it falls on the floor. And the law is that poor people are allowed to pick it. You're not allowed to keep it from yourself. And instead, you have this way to trick the system where you have your poor son pick up the grain behind you as part of your sharecropping work. And the Gemara says, the Rabbi Meir says, that you're stealing from the poor. That's why Torah study is so important, because without it, we don't know what we're doing. We don't know what is proper behavior and what is not proper behavior. And we don't know how to connect with Hashem, and we don't know how to deal between man and man. The Mishnah continues. It says, these are the things, the mitzvot, whose fruits a man eats in this world, but whose principle remains intact for him in the world to come. Honoring one's father and mother, performing acts of kindness, bringing about peace between a man and his fellow, and Torah studies equal to them all. Now, what we see here is we see the mitzvot being split into two things. We could say, performing acts of kindness. That looks like I have to use money to do it. Honoring my father and mother. Perhaps I have to do that with money. But the Torah and the oral law is trying to show us that, no, there's two kinds of mitzvahs here. There's ones that are done with the body, that you go and you do a good deed. And there's ones that are done with money. Hi, here's some money, go buy yourself a nice chicken or something. And the Gemara is splitting this idea into two. And the Mishnah is splitting this idea into two. We know that Shimon Bar Yochai, when he got out of the cave, one of the acts of kindness that he did, he didn't have any money because he was living in a cave for 13 years. He did a performance of an act of kindness to the people in the north. He went and marked the graves so that the Kohanim walking around in the north wouldn't become tamei, and they wouldn't lose their ability to study Torah or to handle Truma and Meiser and things like that. So we see that there's a idea about doing things not only with money but also with the body. And certainly Torah study is something that you do with your body. You open the book and you put your nose in the book and you start to learn it. The other idea here that the Mishnah is talking about is that this idea of fruit in this world and the world to come. The Rambam, in his commentary on the Mishnah, is going to explain that these mitzvahs are no different from all the other mitzvahs. The idea with these mitzvahs is that this idea between man and his fellow occurs so that you have this performance of act of kindness, and that's this thing between man and his fellow. Or Peah is a thing between man and his fellow, between a farmer and the poor person. Or Bikkorim is between the farmer and the Kohanim. You also have these other mitzvot between man and God, like appearing at the temple. Torah study is the access and the way that we know how to figure out how to behave between man and Hashem and between man and man. And that's why you have fruit in this world and fruit in the next world. Another thing that the Rambam points out is that the reward that is given in this world for these things is not taken away from what he's going to get in the world to come. In other words, there's no diminishment. So being kind or making peace between people, you're going to get fruit in this world, but you don't get a diminishment, and you don't get paid in this world and not the next world. You're getting paid in the next world too. And the thing about Torah study being equal to them all is that you're getting fruit in this world, the next world, and you're not getting any diminishment at all in the world to come. And these lists of mitzvot in the Mishnah have this common characteristic where that you have this reward in the world to come. There's a lot of Mishnahs that are unique in that the people only get a reward in the world to come. There's not a lot of mitzvahs where you're getting fruit in this world. And we know that from the Tosfot and Baba Batra Bavli 10a, that normally the enjoyment is reserved for the world to come. The basic reward is in the world to come. But with these mitzvahs, they're particular and they're special. And that's why Peah enumerates them and cares about them and wants us to understand the relationship between these mitzvahs like Peah, Bikkorim, appearing, performing acts of kindness, and how it relates to studying Torah. In other words, if the Mishnah just came along and said, go study Torah, that would be very interesting, but we would have to struggle to try to figure out the meaning of it. And so by laying out that they have these characteristics that are common. It can help us to understand Torah study better. The first sugya is going to get into this quality, and it's going to wonder why in the last part of the mishnah, why is it that a fifth mitzvah wasn't mentioned? We know that the first part of the mishnah has 5 mitzvahs: Peah, Bikkorim, appearing, performing acts of kindness, and Torah study. But the second mitzvah, the second part of the mishnah, why doesn't it have 5 parts? It only has 4 parts. So Rabbi Binyamin Bar Levi says, Rabbi Yitzchak and Rabbi Imi were sitting and asking. They were trying to figure this out. They said, why was Truma not mentioned among them? Truma also has no minimum and no maximum measure, right? In other words, it poses a question. And the Mara Fulda gives a comment. It says, look, there's no quantitative minimum applying to Truma because the law is that the designation of even a single kernel as Truma exempts the entire grain pile from its tevel status. We know that from Hulin 137b. Nor is there any maximum limit for Truma because the Halacha follows Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, who state in the Mishnah and Trumos 4:5 that one may separate as much Truma as he wishes, provided that he leaves over at least some small segment as Hulin. The Gemara assumes at this point that the fact that some segment of the pile must be left as Hulin is not a reason to say that Truma possesses a minimum measure. So it makes sense, right? Like, by biblical law, there has to be something left over. In other words, even if it's just a single grain at the end that is going to be left over as Hulin, there has to be something at the end. So let's say you have a giant storehouse of it. You designate all of it as tevel. As Truma. Well, the problem is that you can't, because there has to be at least one grain, according to the Torah law, that has to be left over. Otherwise, it doesn't qualify. It has to be something left over as Hulin. So that's what they're trying to figure out. Hey, what about minimum measure and maximum measure is this? So we're going to get a deep insight to the structure of the Mishnah and what Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was doing with this. Here's the answer. Rabbi Imi answers and says, it is because the law that Truma has no maximum measure is the subject of a dispute Tanaim and not universally held. So Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Eliezer hold a different view that Truma may not exceed 1/10 or 1/2 of the crop. And so by listing the mitzvahs that have no measure, the Mishnahs are enumerating only the mitzvahs that, according to all opinions, have no measure. And wow, what an amazing thing that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi did when he organized the Mishnah. He tried to put into here something where there's no dispute, there's no malochet tanaim, everybody agrees. What a deep insight, especially when we're talking about trying to make peace between everybody as part of what the Mishnah is talking about. And so here he's putting in something that there's no malochet. He wanted to make sure that everybody involved in the conversation has the same view on it. So here's another answer for it. Rabbi Yossi says, even according to the opinion, there is no maximum for the amount one may designate as Truma. It is still understandable that the Mishnah did not list Truma. Rabbi Yossi says, for a person may make his entire field Bikkorim, while a person may not make his entire field Truma. Rather, he must leave over at least some part of it as Hulin. So we know that from the Mishnah in Bikkorim 2:4, teaches us that one may declare his entire field Bikkorim. In regard to Truma, however, even Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva agree that one may not designate his entire pile as Truma, but must leave over at least some part as Hulin, like a kernel. And the Gemara is now going to conclude that because some Hulin must be left, Truma indeed cannot be said to have a maximum limit, in the same way that other mitzvot in this Mishnah have. In other words, I can be as kind as I want to a person. There's no upper limit to that, and I can take my whole field and dedicate it to Bikkorim, and I can take as many visits to the temple as I want. There's no upper limit. If I want to go to the temple 39 times in one of the holidays, I can go, and I can go not on the holiday. And certainly learning Torah, I mean, the Vilna Gaon used to learn 18, 19, 20, 21 hours a day. There's no upper limit. And so you could say the same thing. But they're challenging it now, and they want to understand this in regards to Peah and Truma. They want to contrast now between Peah and Truma. So there's a challenge. They challenge it, and they say why the Mishnah mentions Peah. And we learn in a Brisa, a man may not make his entire field Peah. Yet the Mishnah listed Peah among the mitzvot that have no measure. So the Maharal Fulda is pointing out that evidently the fact that one must leave over at least something which does not designate as Peah does not disqualify Peah from the inclusion in the list of mitzvot that do not have a measure. And therefore, the Mishnah should have said that do not have a measure. In other words, in the list of mitzvot that do not have a measure. And therefore, the Mishnah should have mentioned Truma as well, even though one must leave over at least something that he does not declare Truma. So Rabbi Yossi is going to answer that. He's going to give us a deeper insight on when Peah is triggered, and it's going to help us to contrast with Truma so that we can settle this once and for all. Rabbi Yossi says the reaping of the first grain, the first stalk of grain, in regard to Peah is analogous to smoothing the pile in regard to Truma. In other words, he's saying that you need something to get the thing started. In Truma, we know that after they haul the pile of all the wheat, and they separate the wheat from the chaff, and they winnow it, and they get everything out, and they start to separate out the final product before it's turned into flour. And then they finally get all the wheat berries done, and then they take their shovel and they smooth it out. That's when it's subject to Truma. And with regards to Peah, it's when they cut the first stalk. The moment the farmer sees the whole field and he cuts the first stalk, that's the point where it's subject to Peah. So both of them have a single point where it becomes triggered, where the mitzvah becomes enabled. So Rabbi Yossi says the reaping of the first stalk of grain in regards to Peah is analogous to the smoothing of the pile in regards to Truma. And as long as one has not yet reaped the first stalk, his field is not obligated in Peah. Once he reaps the first stalk, however, his entire field becomes obligated in Peah. And at that point, if he wishes to declare his entire field Peah, he may do so. So once he cuts this first stalk, in other words, whatever is left, even the entire remainder after that first stalk is cut, he can designate it as Peah. There's no upper limit. But that reaping of the first stalk is necessary in order to trigger the Peah obligation. Regarding Truma, though, again, you got to leave something left over. You have to have at least one kernel left over so that one part of it's Hulin, the other part is Truma. So Rabbi Yossi continues. He says, here, however, in regard to Truma, as long as the pile was not smoothed, his pile does not become obligated in Truma. Yet once he smoothed it, he became obligated. Yet even after it was smoothed and the obligation took effect, if he wishes to make his entire pile Truma, he may not do so. For we learned there in the Mishnah, in Chala 1:9, whoever says my entire grain pile is hereby designated as Truma, or my entire dough is hereby designated as Chala, has not said anything at all. His designation does not take effect until he leaves over at least some grain or some dough, which he does not declare to be Truma or Chala. So in other words, you can see that there's a difference already between Peah and Truma, not only on when it started, but what has to be left over. So after it's been triggered, in the case of Peah, you don't have to leave over anything. But in the case of Truma, or even Chala, which is referred to as type of Truma, you have to leave something. Something has to be left over. Otherwise, it doesn't take effect. And we know, as a rule, in Nedarim that if somebody makes a vow that violates one of the definitions of the Torah or a precept in the Torah, he hasn't said anything at all. It's a vow that is nullified and says nothing. It's bitul, it's nothing. So, having mentioned that cutting the first stalk triggers a pay obligation, the Gemara now is going to present a series of inquiries regarding this first stalk. And very much in this Ravina style, he was from Eretz Yisrael, and in this style of trying to get between the black and the white area, this gray area that's going to be where this fine point is, in this sort of style. So now we're going to get to this first stalk. What happens now that you cut this first stalk that triggers the obligation? So the Gemara asks, it says, what is the law insofar as this first stalk itself being obligated in Peah? In other words, after the first stalk is cut and the Peah obligation is activated, does the obligation take effect also upon the first stalk, or does it apply only to the remaining uncut stalks? That's a good question. So what happens? So the Gemara is going to resolve the inquiry. They're going to say, the Sugi is going to say, is it possible to say so? In other words, to even consider the possibility that the first stalk is obligated to Peah? The cutting of the first stalk is what obligated his entire field in Peah, and it itself should become obligated in Peah. In other words, Peah didn't take effect yet. And because it didn't take effect yet, how can you say that the first stalk is obligated? Because you didn't trigger it yet. Let's say you're standing in the field, you're looking at all the wheat, and you didn't cut the first stalk. Well, if you go and you designate the field to be Peah, or you designate 1/60th to be Peah, you didn't say anything because you didn't trigger the mitzvah yet. So how can you say that the first stalk would be obligated? Because you can't obligate any part of it yet. There's another inquiry regarding the first stalk. If someone harvested the first stalk, but it became burned up before he had the chance to separate Peah, so it doesn't exist anymore, what is the law as to whether he must harvest a second time? In other words, cut a second stalk before he separates Peah. In other words, let's say the first stalk he cuts, and somehow, miraculously, it gets burnt up. It doesn't exist anymore. So, did that obligation for triggering Peah, because this stalk didn't come in, is no longer in the world? Does he have to go do it again? Does he have to go cut a second stalk? Does he have to start the mitzvah again? What's the status? Does he have to trigger this mitzvah a second time because this first stalk is gone? So the Gemara resolves the inquiry. It says, let us learn the answer from the following brisa. If one harvested half of his crop, and then, before he designated this crop, he sold what he harvested, or he harvested half the crop, and before he designated Peah, he consecrated what he harvested. In other words, he gave it to the temple. It says he must give Peah from what remains unsold or unconsecrated on everything. In other words, both of the half that remains in his possession and also the half that he sold or consecrated. And that makes sense because in one case he's getting a profit, and so you could say that that the remaining stalks are still there, and he's getting a benefit on at least half of the harvested field. In the case of it being designated, here's what the note says from the Pnei Moshe. It says, if the seller stipulated at the time he sold the unharvested portion that he was selling it less than the amount due as Peah for the entire field, or if someone harvested half the field and then consecrated the unharvested half, any person who redeems that half from the temple as hekdesh must separate sufficient Peah to cover the entire field. The temple treasury itself does not separate Peah. So even the hekdesh itself, so even if the hekdesh itself owns and harvests the field, because the law is that hekdesh is exempt from Peah. So the Gemara is teaching that the converse of this mishnah is also true. If somebody harvested half the field or sold and consecrated the other half, the seller or the consecrator must separate enough peah from the half that remains in his possession to cover the entire field. In other words, even the sold or consecrated portion. So the sugya continues. It says, well, what happens if it was not consecrated and it was burnt up? So, no, sorry, that's a question. It says, now, is that which was consecrated not as if it was burnt up? In other words, the Marafuld is saying that it is understandable in the case in which he sold the harvested half that he should have to separate peah from the entire field because he has benefit. Even though he doesn't own the harvested grain anymore, he gets benefit. He's richer by the amount of money he obtained from the sale. But why must he separate peah for the entire field if he consecrated the harvested half? Insofar as the consecrator is concerned, the consecrated half is as if it was burnt up since he receives no benefit whatsoever. And this gets into a deeper point. This idea that we perform a mitzvah not because it's considered a benefit. In other words, mitzvahs weren't given for the purpose of deriving benefit. We know that from the famous point about the ram's horn on Rosh Hashanah. We do mitzvahs because we're commanded by Hashem. That's why we do mitzvahs. We're not doing mitzvahs because we're dafka getting something out of it. And with this idea, then you shouldn't be getting some derivation of benefit out of it. So you have two different cases. You have the case where it's sold or the case where it's consecrated. In the case where it's consecrated, it's like it's burnt up. There's another inquiry regarding the first stalk. If the farmer finished off the field to the end, and he harvests the entire field without leaving peah, in which case you say that the obligation of peah reverts to the sheaves. What is the law insofar as the obligation of peah reverts to the first cut stalk? In other words, they're saying that, let's say you're cutting everything, and you cut everything down, and now you have this pile of sheaves, and you're saying basically like, somewhere in there's a minimum measure of 1/60th that he's required to leave in the standing grain. So now what? Now what do you do? So this is effectively saying that the pay is still in there in those sheaves at 1/60th, and the obligation is going to revert to those sheaves. So you cut it. That's not the way to do the mitzvah. There's a lot of problems with doing the mitzvah that way. You prevent poor people from coming collecting it in a reasonable way. Poor people have an expectation that it'll be standing in the field. The Torah mentions to leave it standing in the field. But let's say, for whatever reason, you cut it down. Well, that obligation, they're saying, is still in the sheaves. It's still there. So that, in there you have this first stalk somewhere mingled in there, but you also have these stalks that are obligated in there, and it has to be calculated out so that you can leave it. The Gemara is going to answer, Rabbi Yossi is going to say, we should derive the law regarding peah from the sheaves, from the law regarding peah of the standing grains. Just as regarding peah of the standing grain, the peah obligation does not revert to the first cut stalk. And so too, peah of the sheaves, the peah obligation does not revert to the first cut stalk. So the note here by the Pnei Moshe is that it is reasonable to assume that the obligation that falls on the sheaves is not a new obligation, but rather a transfer of the old obligation from the stalks to the sheaves, and therefore, just as when the obligation existed on the stalks, it did not apply to the first stalk, and so too, it does not apply to the first stalk when it's just a bunch of sheaves piled up. Now the mishnah the conversation is going to move on, and it's going to get to the other mitzvahs. So these things have no measure, Peah and Bikkorim, and the Gemara cites a brisa that explains it. It says, Peah has a minimum measure, but it does not have a maximum measure. And Bikkorim and appearing at the temple, on the other hand, neither have a maximum or a minimum measure. So we know that by rabbinic law, there is no minimum measure for Bikkorim or appearing at the temple. But the Brise's point is that Peah, Bikkorim, and appearing at the temple have no measure, but the Mishnah does not mean both a minimum and maximum measure, because Peah does in fact possess a minimum measure. It's 1/60th. That's D'Rabbanan. By the way, just as a note, there are a lot of ways that the sugyas in the Yerushalmi Shas try to prove in the writing of the Lashon Kodesh that 1/60th is in fact in there, and also the 1/50th and 1/40th, so that this is not really just up in the air, that there really is a tradition on how we know 1/60th is there. So this is, Doraita, the way it's written, Doraita, without those other ways to read it. Even if you leave one stalk at the end, that's still technically Peah, but the rabbis put as a rule, the Rabbanan, that it's 1/60th, and you have to leave 1/60th. So rabbinically, Peah does possess a minimum measure, but the Mishnah means that these mitzvahs have no maximum measure. In other words, the Peah does have a minimum measure of 1/60th, which is D'Rabbanan, and that's D'Rabbanan, but it'd be still imprecise to say that these mitzvahs have no minimum measure, since rabbinically at least, Peah does have a minimum measure. So, according to the Brisa, the Mishnah means that Peah, Bikkorim, and appearing at the temple have neither a maximum or a minimum measure. And although the rabbis decreed that one may not leave for Peah less than a 60th, since that measure is not biblical, it is not inaccurate to say that Peah has no minimum measure. So there's going to be a second Brisa to try to explain this. It says, and there is a Tana who taught Peah, Bikkorim, and appearing in the temple have neither a maximum nor a minimum measure. And what is the halakhic difference between these two Brisas? Why, in the final analysis, both Brisas agree that by rabbinic law, one may not leave less than 1/60th? So the Pnei Moshe says, as explained, the first Brisa maintains that although biblically there is no minimum for Peah, since the rabbis did impose a minimum, it would be inaccurate to say that Peah has no minimum. And the second Brisa, however, feels that by biblical law, one may leave any amount of Peah, and it is not inaccurate to say that Peah has neither a minimum or maximum measure. So, even if somebody leaves and gives less than what the rabbis required, what he gave belongs to the poor. And even before he makes up that shortfall to make it 1/60th, he may not take it back. In other words, he can't undo it. The Gemara is going to answer, and it's going to move the conversation forward. And it's going to get to a really important point that we need to keep in mind about the nature of Peah. So the Gemara answers. It says, one who says that Peah has a minimum measure but does not have a maximum measure. So in other words, the holder of the first Brisa holds that if he gave less than a 60th, even though he is still obligated to make up the difference between what he gave and a 60th, what he gave, he gave. In other words, it belongs to the poor, and he may not take it back. But both that amount and whatever he adds to it after are obligated in Meiser until he makes up the difference between that amount and the 60th. But the one who says in the other Brisa that Peah, Bikkorim, and appearing in the temple have neither a maximum or minimum measure from that second Brisa holds that what he gave for Peah is already exempt from Meiser. And whatever he subsequently adds to that amount in order to complete the rabbinic minimum of 1/60th is obligated in Meiser. In other words, in either case, you're obligated in Meiser. You're just obligated in different ways. So with a different explanation for why you're obligated. There's no disagreement that if you're coming to add to it later, and you're adding to the amount of Peah later, that it's subject to Meiser. And there's a problem because if you don't separate it out properly, you don't do it to Rabbanan and separate out 1/60th, and then you try to go add from it, then effectively what you're doing is you're making a mess because effectively you didn't give the tithes in order. We know that there's a Torah law that you have to give the tithes in order. And if you don't give the tithes in order, mathematically you make a mess because now you're taking away from Maestros. I'm sorry, you're taking away from the poor and you're taking away from the Levi in some cases. In some cases, you could be taking away from the Levi by giving too much Peah, and in other cases, you can be taking away from the poor person because now the poor person has to separate out the Meiser. And we know that the Torah obligates the farmer to separate out Peah. That belongs to the poor person. But we also know that if he doesn't do it right and he separates too little and then he adds to it, now he's impoverishing the poor person because he's forcing him to separate tithes. And that's something that in both cases are that you don't have to do tithes on it. It's an interesting thing because a lot of this Masechet has to do with when things come into ownership, and you have to look at a lot of Zerayim because you don't have ownership of the crop yet. You have to separate your tithes in order to have ownership of it. And in this case, Peah is one of those steps. Like you have to leave over for the poor person because you don't actually have full ownership of this yet. So we're going to get tomorrow into why Truma is not in. We know why from today why Truma is not listed in this list of the Mishnah, but we're going to get into a list of other questions, other mitzvot, and ask about more mitzvot and about minimum and maximum measure. And we're going to try to get into tomorrow about the temple service and also what's going on in the temple service and how learning Torah connects with this idea of the majesty of Torah, of Keter and crown. And really, without learning Torah, you can't understand what you're supposed to be doing with your time and with what you're supposed to be doing in order to earn, reward in this world and the world to come. And I encourage everybody to really start trying to get into Torah learning. If you're not learning Torah, get yourself a rabbi, a Haredi Orthodox rabbi. Get involved with a yeshiva, even if you're doing some learning by phone. And start trying to learn Gemara and Mishnah and Torah and Scripture, and do it in a way that follows a tradition that's handed down from teacher to student since Moshe Rabbeinu. Thank you so much.